I don't know how you expect me to follow that. Great job, guys. That was fantastic. Hey, I don't know about you, but this is my favorite time of year. I love Christmas. It goes back to my childhood with all the sense of expectation. I loved all the parts of it. I loved all the traditions that came with it. I'm already looking forward to living Christmas through my kids this next couple hours. They're bouncing off the walls. They can't wait. It's the only day of the year I can get my 6-year-old to bed on time. He actually wants to go to bed so he can wake up the next day. There's something really genuinely magical about Christmas when we think about it. But sometimes what I found in my own personal life is that there's something about the Christmas season that can actually bring some hardships for me. For some people, Christmas is wonderful, and for others, it's a tough time, right? Depends on the circumstances you've been going through that past year or even the past couple of months. One of the things I've come to realize the older I get that I find Christmas brings is a season of kind of depression for me. It's something I've struggled with. It's something especially since I've moved to Vancouver. Those of you who don't know me, I'm not from the Northwest. I thought the Northwest was going to have a climate similar to the rest of the West Coast. When I think of West Coast, I think of California. It's not sunny here, is it, right? So one of the things I come to realize as I get older, the things that I need in my life in ways I didn't realize when I was a kid growing up on the East Coast was I need sun. Isn't there something really powerful about the sun? Something you take for granted in the summertime when it's light all those days, but once you get to the dark hours of this time of year, the short hours, like here's what I've come to realize is that because we live, winter solstice has just sort of passed us by. The sun's going down at 4:15. So those days where, you start to work, you go to work, you take your kids to school. By the time you're driving home from work, it's already dark outside. There's something that kind of messes with my head about that kind of thing. We live on the 49th parallel, which means the closer we get to the north, the darker it tends to get. I have friends who live in Florida, and they're telling me that their sunsets are closer to 6 o'clock. What I wouldn't give for a 6 o'clock sunset this time of year, we have it at 4:15. The other things I come to realize is moving to the Northwest, there's this thing called clouds. And oh my goodness, is it ever cloudy here for about half of the year. And I'm not just talking about those beautiful fluffy white clouds. I'm talking about those dark, gray, almost oppressive clouds, the amount of rain that we get. See, I find that this time of year, I have this tendency to struggle because of this lack of sun. And the irony of this is that I put myself in front of light all the time to try to bring some sort of a substitute. So what I do is when I'm home, I turn on all the lights. I even have one of those sun lamps that, is supposed to mimic the sun. I put it in front of me. I find that most of my work is done at a computer, which is shining artificial light on you. I find that because I'm doing my education continually online, that I'm in front of a computer. And when I want to entertain myself with my wife or kids, what do? I sit in front of the TV that's producing light. And yet, in spite of all those things, I still feel kind of worn out at the end of the day. You see, what I've come to understand and start to realize about myself the older I get is that this time of year is difficult for me, not just because there's the absence of light from the sun, but it's the substitute of the artificial light that's actually contributing to making me feel worse and worse. Because when there's something artificial that we use to substitute the real thing, it might give the appearance, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's anything other than a knockoff, a cheap knockoff of that real healthy, good, vitamin D producing thing we call the sun. I lived in New York before I moved back to Vancouver, back to Canada, this part of the world. And when I was in New York, my wife and I, we go to the city all the time. When we go to the city, we love to go to the street vendors. Have you ever seen the New York City street vendors? They're going to sell you Gucci bags, and they're going to sell you Rolex watches, and they're going to sell you Oakley sunglasses at 1% of the cost of what they really are. You look at it hard, you handle it in your hands, and you think, this looks too real, too authentic. And it's a knockoff. It's not the real deal, but no one else is going to be able to see that on the surface. And so you spend the money thinking that you just got a great deal until that week later when the bag rips apart, when the glasses break on your nose, and when the Rolex starts to stop working in the first place. You see, the thing about cheap knockoffs is on the surface they might look like the real thing, but in reality they're just poor substitutes. They're terrible knockoffs of the real deal. I find that at Christmas time, when we're in so desperately need of this thing called light, when so many of us choose to holiday down south or take maybe for some of us, our second homes down in Arizona or down in Florida, we do that because there's something about us that just needs that authentic, real deal thing. Nothing really takes the place of the real deal. When I read about the Christmas story, a story I'm going to read with you here in just a quick moment, this is a time and place when people knew all about what substitutes looked like, what cheap knockoffs, inauthenticity looked like in the day and age they lived in. If you grew up in Israel in the time of Jesus, when he came to this earth, it was a terrible time to live, especially if you lived in the corner of the world called Israel. There was a king who reigned over Israel, but he was a substitute king. He was a cheap knockoff. He was a counterfeit king. He had no royal ancestry. He had no royal blood inside of him. He ruled because he cozied up to the greatest empire the world had ever seen up to that point. It was an empire called Rome. And in Rome, he ruled through terror and fear. The people did not like him. They did not see him as king, but they still bowed to him as king because they had to, or else they would suffer the consequences of the might of Rome. Which leads me to the second counterfeit that existed in Israel at this time. It's called peace. You see, Rome promoted this thing called Roman peace. Do you know what Roman peace was? It was the peace of the conquered. You were taken over. All of your armies, all of the enemies, all the opposers had been killed. And so there was peace in the land, but it was peace at the point of a sword. If you dared to try to self-authenticate yourself or rule yourself again, the legions would be coming in a matter of months to reinforce their peace. And on top of that, most of us, when we think of Israel, we think of religion, don't we? Even if we don't have a lot of knowledge of the Bible, we know that, there's this group of people that have religion as part of their history. But it was a warped time for Israel and its religion. The priests of the time, again, they weren't even supposed to be the authentic priests that were called to rule and guide people in that time. More than that, they decided to bring all of these obligations and rules and things that weren't even mentioned in the scriptures as how to know God, understand him, and live in authentic relationship with him. They would pile on these expectations, rules that they themselves were not even willing to follow themselves. They were tied in with politics and greed and just whatever made them hold on to power. You see, it seemed like it was a time that had a kingdom and had peace and had religion, but anyone who was living at that corner of the world at that time in history knew that it was anything but authentic. And yet, there's an event that will happen in the midst of this. The people of this time, hoping against hope, that the God of their ancestors, the God they'd called out to numerous times before, would show up in a powerful way, and he does, but he does it in a most unexpected way. I want to read you a short passage. You've heard this passage before. Even if you don't go to church, and you've heard the story told from the Peanuts Christmas cartoon, you know this story. It's told every single year, but it's told from the book of Luke, chapter 2, verse 1. It says this: In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea to Bethlehem to the town of David because he belonged to the house and the line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him, and she was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. And she gave birth to their firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room available for them. And there were shepherds living out of the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all people. Today, in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is Messiah, Christ the Lord. This will be the sign to you. You will find the baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." Suddenly, a great company of heavenly hosts appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests." When I was 13 years old, I was going through a very tough time of my life, as many 13-year-olds do. I had just moved. I was in a new school system. And for the first few months, the thing that matters most to a 13-year-old, which is acceptance, which is peer influence, which is just having friends and being liked and being talked to, I didn't have any of those. Everyone was going on with their life. I remember the awful feeling of being in and around people every single day, but being alone. That is such an isolating feeling. I remember one winter day like the one we're having here. I was walking to school as I did every other time. It took me about 15 minutes. There was a kid I noticed who always walked on the other side of the road. And for some reason on this day, he decided to take his headphones off of his ears and walk across the street and say, "Hi, my name is John," and we just proceeded to walking to school together and talking about hockey. And then he did it again the next day, and the next day, and the day after that. And eventually, he invited me over to his house because he only lived a few houses down from me. And we started this friendship that 25 years later, even though he's on the opposite coast, he's still one of my best friends. You know what was powerful about that experience? Was the power of being seen. There's something so powerful when we feel isolated and alone, when we're going through difficulty, when we're hurting, when we're experiencing the dark days of life, that there is someone who sees us. The power of this story is twofold. The first one is this, is that God saw the misery of his people. And he stepped in to announce that he was enacting a new thing. But when you read this story, you're not just to read it as something that happened years ago. You're to step into the story. So the point is this. God sees you. On your up days, on your down days. When you're in need, when you have plenty. When you're lonely, and when you have family. He sees you. And that's a powerful reality. Not only does he see, but he came to announce something beautiful, something that would forever change the world. But here's what I want you to catch before we close today. Who were the people he announced to? It was not royalty. It was not religious leaders. It was shepherds. We love the shepherds. They're part of our nativity scene. We see them on our Christmas cards, don't we? But here's the thing. Shepherds in ancient Israel were the lowest of the lowest caste. They were nobodies. You did not interact with them. You did not touch them. They dealt with dirty animals. They were, even to the poor in Israel, considered outcasts. And yet, the announcement of the Christ child coming to, watch this, bring hope and real peace and real light came to these men. The power of that story is this, that in coming as one of us and being announced to the lowest of us, he's come for all of us. Christ came at the right time in history to show us that he is the peace, the light, the hope that all of us have been so longing for. That authentic, real thing had finally come. I was noticing here this past week, we've had a crazy weather week. Wasn't quite sure what today was going to bring. I'm glad that you're here, though. But didn't you find that in the midst of a snowstorm I haven't seen in the 5 years since I've lived here, that there were 2 days right in the midst of snow coming down, where not only did it stop, but the sun completely came out. Did you notice that? When the skies were blue and you were walking outside, and I was playing with my kids outside, and there's something about that authentic sun, that authentic light that is so different from the artificial one I talked about at the beginning, shone down and just lifted my spirits. It was the real thing. Just because Christ was announced 2,000 years ago doesn't mean that there's still not darkness in the world. We know that's true. There's oppression, there's hurt, there's pain. But in the world where there's hurt, there's also light, and that light is Christ. And where there's despair, there's light, and that light is Christ. And where there's oppression, still today there's light, and that light is Christ. And for those of us who have been tied to the light, we are encouraged and we are honored to spread that light outward. I'm going to invite the band and some of the ushers up forward right now for us to kind of conclude our service together. If those who are ushering could come right up. What we're going to do is we're going to do a tradition that churches all over the world are doing here tonight. We're going to sing Silent Night together. We love this song. And we're going to represent it through the lighting of candles. And so what I'm going to ask for those of you, as the ushers come and bring your candle, please hold your candle upright as they lean the light into you, especially mom and dad, if you have kids, would you just sort of help them and then just lean your light into their candle and hold it there for a second as we sing Silent Night together. May this be occasion that when we do this, it's not just a song that we're singing. It's not just a tradition that we're continuing on with countless millions around the world today, but may we actually spiritually encounter the Christ child who came as light and hope in the midst of darkness. And symbolically, as you spread those lights, may you remember that the light is not just for you, but it's for you to spread to others all over the world. So would you join us in this time together as we sing this beautiful song?